Welcome to the Open Minds live show. I'm your host, Christopher Balkaran, and I'm trying to inject some level of moderate discourse in our increasingly politically polarized world. So I'm hoping that you're enjoying my content. If you are, hit that like button, definitely subscribe, share, tell all your friends. Folks, I was recently watching Jubilee's video, Charlie Kirk versus 20 woke students. And there were two topics that Charlie covered, and I found his responses to be they could be considered as inflammatory, and this is precisely why the left gets so upset with the right, because we seem heartless, or et cetera, et cetera. So I thought to myself, why don't I redo some of Charlie's answers and see if we can come to some form of agreement on some level on understanding at least different perspectives? Because often I find that's the impasse. It's very hard for us to understand each other because we're talking in very inflammatory rhetoric. So I'm going to share these two with you and we'll go from there.
Next claim is that Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate. A lot of competition, Mason.
Yeah, exactly.
Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
Can I define what a DEI candidate is?
I think that you're going to say because she's black and she's a woman, she was appointed because Joe Biden promised that, and it's not a testament to her success.
Not only that, but also in her getting the nomination, the Democrat Party, they said repeatedly, we do not want to pass over a black female.
Okay.
So just those two things, but the first one is stronger. You're right. Joe Biden said, I'm going to put on my vice presidency a black female. Right. So his criteria was, and that was like Karen Bass and Kamala Harris.
Okay.
So she was not chosen because of her intellect or her accomplishments or because of any of that. It was because she happened to fit a couple boxes. In fact, Amy Klobuchar, the vetting at the time was that Amy Klobuchar would have been a better VP, and Kamala ended up getting it. So it's just a statement of fact that she is there not because of her brilliance or accomplishments, but because of her ethnicity.
So Kamala Harris, first and foremost, there are a lot of criticisms that you can give to her on why she wouldn't be an effective president. It shouldn't be because she's a woman or because she's black. And it seems to be that you're saying that.
No, I just want people to understand and agree she didn't earn this.
She absolutely did. She has a career where she's been not only a DEI.
DEI stands for
one of the biggest.
Didn't earn it, just so we're clear. But
it stands for diversity, equity, inclusion. I like the meme though.
I know what it is. But
so this is where I think, and I think that Charlie Kirk is trying to be funny or whatever, but I do think that there's something that I wish Mason and Charlie started off with, which is, and this is where perhaps some people on the right may roll their eyes at me, and that's okay, but there are unique experiences of black women in positions of leadership. Now, I'm going to kind of go through that so that we understand a little bit more about that, but then I'm also going to understand some of the criticisms with that. So there are experiences many black women share of their experiences in leadership. But before I do, actually, it's interesting that, Kamala Harris is of mixed race ethnicity, and there's this almost fixation on her black racial identity or her black ancestry and not her, I think she's Sri Lankan or Indian ancestry, which is also interesting and perhaps a separate topic we should one day talk about. But regardless, I think it's very important we talk about the experience of black women in positions of leadership, because many black women have documented that they feel like others are looking past them. Nobody really gives them their credit. Nobody respects their authority. Nobody respects their position that they're in. A perfect example of this was I think it was last year, president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, got in a lot of trouble for the pro-Palestinian protests that were happening. And there were articles written about her plagiarism in her thesis, etc. And I wrote about this on my blog. By the way, if you haven't already, subscribed to my blog, openminds.substack.com. And what I said, again, folks, just to be clear, I actually am right of center. I am more conservative than I am liberal on social and economic issues, generally speaking. But when I started doing my research on this, what I found was paper after paper documented that black women in positions of leadership are more scrutinized for their credentials than their white male counterparts. And I thought this was kind of like hogwash a little bit. I'm like, come on, that's my kind of come on, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But the more I read different academic research articles, the more I saw this unique, consistent experience that black women had. Now, I think this is very important for this discussion because perhaps liberals saw Kamala Harris as a mixed race woman, and they were also very cognizant of this research, specifically of black women in positions of leadership. Now, this is where I think the right stumbles, and I've said this before in previous live streams, with the issue of race. because the issue of race is definitely, to an extent, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But there is something to be said about stereotype and discrimination that manifests when someone pulls themselves up by the bootstraps and enters into leadership positions. Now, again, this is the liberal side, which isn't talked about in this YouTube video on Jubilee, but I think it's very well worth repeating. Now, the limitations of that. So we understand that experience, but the limitations, and perhaps this is where the Democrats or the liberals get the, what do you call it? The solution or the, whatever you call it, the prescription wrong. My words can't come to me today. But where the liberals get the prescription wrong is they say, well, we need to have more Black women in positions of leadership. And it begs the question, and this is a question I'll pose, do you think that that is the best way of doing that? Because in many ways, it can very well serve to fuel people who will criticize those women and say, hey, by the way, they only got it because they're Black, because they're a woman, and they needed like a DEI, to Charlie Kirk's argument. They needed a DEI candidate for that role. So the way in which it's framed, it's automatically that Charlie is discrediting Kamala Harris. Now, putting aside her background for a second, it's, even if Kamala Harris was the top of her class, the best at everything, we have to remember Condoleezza Rice was a prominent Republican in the George W. Bush administration. I don't think any Republican disputes Condoleezza Rice's experience and qualifications. And so that sometimes is the lens that we have to remind ourselves of, that where conservatives seem to be more critical of Black women in positions of leadership, particularly when they are liberal or espouse liberal democratic values. But should they be conservative, many of us are much more quiet about that. And I see this too with conservatives when we talk about like Candace Owens, right? There are many TikTokers and people who are saying, well, if Candace Owens was running, we would vote for her. Now, Candace Owens has said some things that I don't agree with. She said things that I do agree with. But I noticed that we're less likely to be as critical of Black conservative women than we are Black liberal or Democrat women, specifically when it comes to their credentials, when it comes to their background, what they've done. Now, when you consider Kamala Harris's background, that's when I think conservatives do have a point, because, I've said this before, but, Kamala Harris inherited the delegate system. She inherited the delegate system. She did not win delegates. That should have been discussed more in this Jubilee discussion, but it wasn't. So I'm going to keep letting it roll and we'll go from there.
Do you at least admit and acknowledge that when Joe Biden was searching for a VP, he cared more about skin color and a female than the smartest, best person?
So the whole conversation with this affirmative action with DEI, the whole reason why people bring it in is to make this imaginary scenario that there's a super qualified white man who was overpassed by this unqualified, stupid, idiot person of color, which is such a terrible analogy because it's not true.
His own team
it's absolutely not true.
Mason,
that's not what it is. Joe Biden did not say, I'm going to choose an unqualified person and just his own team.
His own team.
He's saying that I'm going to have two qualified people. If one comes from a different experience, it might be better to have a diversity and have a better perception.
He said
in forms of
government. He said at the South Carolina debate that I will pick a Black woman as my vice president. Secondly, Amy Klobuchar came out.
Is this a random Black woman that he plucked off the street? Or is this a qualified DEA general attorney who's had a decorated career leading government positions? But you keep rambling about things that just aren't relevant to what we're talking about.
It is relevant. Amy Klobuchar in vetting came across as the more qualified candidate.
Why?
Because they said Kamala Harris wasn't very smart, wasn't very bright. That's their own vetting documents.
From who?
Joe Biden's own vetting documents.
So why would he go against that?
Because the base of the Democrat Party demands tribal politics and DEI politics over competency.
Yes.
So I think this is where some liberals look at conservatives as racist, or, they're not concerning diverse people with diverse backgrounds, etc. Because Kirk, although he has a point, he buries that in with, well, liberals are concerned with tribal politics, they're concerned with skin color, etc. I think, to be honest, if liberals made a more nuanced about including people from different backgrounds, they would actually make a lot more sense. But often liberals fall into the trap of only looking at someone's skin color and ethnicity, and they don't look as much into their academic qualifications. And so they don't make that narrative strong enough, right? So Kamala Harris, in many ways, in my opinion, sometimes I think she was set up to fail, because if you think about it, Kamala Harris inherited the delegates that Joe Biden won and fought for in 2019 or 2020 when he was campaigning. She inherited that. And when you ask her on policy issues, she stumbles, she doesn't give clear answers. And I wish the Democratic Party did some form of electoral college system when they were choosing their leader, so that if Kamala Harris won with enough delegates, there would be no disputing her role in heading up the Democratic Party. But in many ways, looking at her through this one-dimensional lens and then her inheriting Biden's delegates, I think that actually played to many conservatives who said she must be a DEI candidate because there's no way that a candidate would be selected, handpicked, to become the next presidential nominee without making a case to the American people. And then you layer on, oh, she's of mixed race ethnicity and she's a woman, while conservatives are like, well, clearly she was chosen, because liberals only look at people, in this case, through that one-dimensional lens. So anyways, all that to say, I think in this scenario, Charlie Kirk could have done a better job understanding the experiences of Black women in positions of leadership, specifically Black women in positions of leadership, and talk about some of the limitations of the pull yourself up by the bootstraps type of analogy that conservatives echo, myself included. But at the same time, I think in this case, Mason on the other side should have echoed that, but also have understood that, yes, there is preferential treatment to Black women to positions of power. There are limitations with that, but we also have to recognize that, and use other examples like Claudine Gay and Harvard, etc. So basically, there's points on both sides, but I think that this issue hangs both sides up. It can't just be pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and it can't just be put Black women in positions of leadership, because in many ways, you're setting many women up for failure. And I think this Kamala Harris losing to Trump was very indicative of how the Democrats really bungled Kamala Harris as a person and as a brand. And now I don't know if she'll be someone who will be considered for leadership within the party moving forward. Okay, this is the second one that came up, and I think this had to do with proportional representation, but we'll get into that.
You're welcome.
30 on, 30 off.
How do you feel about the Senate?
As far as her tie-breaking vote of the Senate?
No. I'm just saying like Senate. Like the Senate is technically DEI in a certain sense for like small states. Like Wyoming gets people in Wyoming get a greater vote than me in California.
Like Rhode Island and Hawaii.
I'm giving you an example. California, I get less of a vote than someone who exists in Wyoming. So we're giving people in Wyoming more say than they necessarily should, given that they're one individual. So why do you believe in DEI as it relates to how our government is set up? But you don't believe in DEI in terms of allowing for people who are Black or who are women to be in positions of power that they have not been allowed in, historically speaking.
Okay, so this is an interesting but confusing point from Parker. So if you look at the U.S. Senate, they provide representatives per state, and it's just equal. So like I think each state gets 2 senators per state, regardless of population. So California has like 40 million people, but Wyoming may have much less than that. They both get the same amount of senators. And my assumption, I haven't read the papers on this, but my assumption thinking about the Federalists would be that they need equal representation from all 50 all states, because it's a federation. And you don't want to have too many Californians, too many New Yorkers, etc., because then it gets skewed and Wyoming will feel left out and they'll be like, well, what the heck is the point of me being part of this United States of America system? I'm out of here. This doesn't make sense. We're in an independent country, etc., etc. That's my sense, because otherwise, why would states with lower populations like make it into or want to be part of a confederacy like the United States of America, right? So it's not like a unique thing. I'm certain that this happened since time immemorial across many federal states. Here in Canada, Ontario, Quebec, we're basically, I can't even remember the percentage of the population, but we're a major percent of the entire Canadian population. But we have provinces and provincial governments similar to Prince Edward Island, Saskatchewan, with very small populations. So the question would be, well, why are senators equally represented in the Senate than California and New York? And Parker makes this comparison that like, well, that's DEI. because from Parker's perspective, that's an equity lens. I guess that's an inclusive lens. That's a way of saying that everyone's equal regardless of the state in which you represent. It's a bit of an odd argument, but I'm trying to piece it together. I can kind of see what Parker is saying because there are unique perspectives from Wyoming in this case that would not be made to the Senate floor had they not have Senate representation. So I think that's his understanding, and I can understand that to an extent. But I think the fallacy with that argument is that he is looking at the federal state system and equating that to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And diversity, equity, and inclusion, as I understand it, is saying, hey, specific groups have a history of being underrepresented or neglected from decision-making power on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, et cetera, right? So if you're going to extend that to a state apparatus, it doesn't make total sense because the state apparatus is in nature. It's not unitary, it's federal. So it needs state representation. That's the framework of a federal state, a federal, like the United States government. So it's a bit odd because DEI is about underrepresentation, historical exclusion. And the federal state needs Wyoming to be there. Otherwise, it's not a federal state. It can't be a federation of states if states aren't represented some way, some shape, or form in the House or in the Senate. But let's keep going.
So, is the Electoral College and the Senate based on race?
It's predicated off of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right, like inclusion of country areas, inclusion of rural areas, inclusion of white men like you.
Okay, so you mean like Hawaii?
I'm referencing. You could say smaller states or places that have less people in it. So obviously would be able to have more of a say per individual.
So your argument is that the U.S. Senate is a DEI. I gotta be honest, I've never heard that argument, but I think it's a little silly. But
how is it silly? Argue against it instead of just saying it's silly.
Well, right. So it's silly on its face because, first of all, we have on the House of Representatives a proportional population.
Oh, but the Senate isn't. So it's DEI.
It's not DEI.
Yes, it is.
Why would you say it's diversity, equity, inclusion? Because Wyoming gets 2 senators. They're their own sovereign state, aren't they?
For country areas, for rural areas, equity for rural areas.
That's not
right, for smaller states.
So let's go back to the Federalist Papers and the Founding Fathers. Why was the Senate composed?
Can you tell me why it's not DEI? Like under your definition, why is it not DEI?
Because it's not based on race. And by the way,
it doesn't have to be based on race.
It's not based on equity, and it's not based on inclusion.
Can't you have DEI based upon different characteristics other than race?
Let me finish.
Whether or not you're a woman, whether or not.
Let me finish. Why? It's because we are a collection of states. We are not a federal project. So states' rights usurp federal. Do you know what the 17th Amendment is?
Do you know why the Articles of Confederation failed?
Yes, but what is the 10th Amendment?
Because states had too many rights, had too much power.
What is the 10th
That's why
Amendment?
we specifically adopted the Constitution.
Parker, let me make one point, okay? Which is, how did we used to elect senators?
It'd be population.
No, we used to elect senators based on state legislatures. So the Senate is an extension of the state legislative bodies. That's not DEI. That's federalism. No, that's the way that our system is set up, which is a bottom-up, citizen-led government to allow the states, which are first and foremost sovereign. So it goes in this ladder in this country.
That's still DEI for those states, citizens, and for those country areas.
No, because it's colorblind. It's not that.
Again, DEI is not only based on race.
Hold on a second.
Diversity for country, diversity for rural, equity for rural, and inclusion of rural.
That's
DEI.
Interesting point. So
you think DEI is only race because you associate it with Kamala Harris?
Let me ask you a question. Is there a single instance in corporate America where DEI is implemented where diversity means anything other than skin color diversity?
So diversity.
No, it's not about viewpoint.
Women.
What? Fine. How about?
So this is where I think Parker actually makes some interesting points, but he stumbles when it comes to Charlie Kirk asking him about DEI in the workplace and as we understand it in nomenclature today. And I think that is actually a very interesting intersection that both liberals and conservatives should talk about. Proportional representation based on different, proximity, rural, etc., is not how liberals and Democrats understand DEI. And that is kind of like the failure, I think, of DEI and its understanding for liberals. From a conservative lens, I can kind of see what Parker's saying. It is representative of people of different communities. In fact, that's why the Electoral College system makes sense, right? Like if Christopher is running for president of the United States, I have to go to New York, I have to go to Florida, I have to go to New Hampshire. I have to go to Connecticut. I have to go to North Dakota, South Dakota. I have to crisscross the nation and I have to win delegates over. My plan can't just be for downtown New Yorkers or, beach going people in LA or wherever. Like, it has to be for all Americans. And if it isn't, I'm not going to win the nomination to be president of the United States. So I do see Parker's point from an inclusion lens when we're thinking of the Senate and proportion and it being, okay, well, we need Wyoming, we need North Dakota, we need South Dakota. But I think where Parker's stumbling block is that DEI lens is not how most liberals and Democrats understand DEI, the term, to be. In fact, I would argue, and this is just me, but DEI's failure sometimes is they don't seem to also understand that there are real issues that white men from rural areas face when trying to make their point to downtown New Yorkers or Washington elitists. The whole idea of Washington elitists is because so many from rural parts of the country, white people as well, feel like they're totally disconnected from Washington and they're just a bunch of people making a bunch of decisions. They have nothing to do with them, and so I think that's a real concern. And I think Parker, to be honest, the stumbling block he would fall on is, well, if there are rural people from, let's say, Texas who say they want to secede from the United States of America, and they were made up of Black, white, Hispanic people because they felt totally disconnected from Washington, the DEI and how we understand it through that race and ethnicity-based lens would completely fall apart, right? Because the federation itself would break away because there's no longer that connection to Washington that, in this case, Texas has. So I think the Federalists, when they were making brokering these deals, they were saying, listen, we need Texas in the Confederation. We need Wyoming in the Federation. We need all of these states to be one, to believe in that they have a voice. So in order to do that, we have to put some water in our wine. We have to give them some power. And to do that, the Senate will have 2 representatives from each state, and they'll have power on the Senate floor to vote for or against all bills that come towards them. So I think, again, interesting arguments, but I think I don't think it's right to apply the DEI lens to proportional representation. Remember, it's a federal state, and they're making decisions for keeping the state together. And I think Parker's debate on having a federal lens, a DEI lens to that, it falls apart when we start thinking of rural-based communities that feel totally disconnected from Washington and has nothing to do with race. They just feel disconnected to it. And they could very well say, hey, I don't want to be part of this United States anymore. But anyways, I know that was kind of my rambling thoughts, but I thought, let me just put this out there and see what you think about my views on what happened between Charlie Kirk and the 20 woke students. I think there's more nuance to these conversations that are necessary, and we need to come at them through a different lens instead of always, fighting for speaking points. And I feel like sometimes Charlie Kirk does that. He's looking at things sometimes one-dimensionally as well. And to be honest, I think that feeds into the one-dimensional views that a lot of liberals and Democrats have on these very big issues. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd love to know what you think. And again, if you haven't already, subscribe, share, tell all of your friends. My name is Christopher. I'm the host of the Open Minds podcast. Check me out, and I'll catch you in the next one.